Community Viewpoint.
And welcome once again to Community Viewpoint. I'm John Pawlak, your host for this segment. And it's still warm out there. And as you can see, we're at the studio again. So things are looking up a little. I'm going to have two more segments with Dr. Christy Reisinger talking about things related to the COVID-19. The first one, she's going to be talking about an O2 monitor, like the things that you put on your finger. So it's important to find out if you're getting the right amount of oxygen. If you're not, that means you may be contracted, you may have contracted the COVID-19. So listen to what the doctor says, and we'll be right back.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Your Health with Dr. Christy. My name's Dr. Christy Reisinger. The question that I'm going to answer today is, how do I know when I need to go to the emergency room with my symptoms from COVID-19? There's so many people out there that want to monitor their symptoms at home, and a lot of advice that we've been giving is stay at home unless your symptoms get more severe. Well, what does that mean? How do I know that my symptoms are so severe that I should go to the emergency room? Well, I'd like to answer that today. I want to remind everyone that the vast majority of patients that have COVID-19 are going to have relatively mild symptoms. That means those patients with mild disease will have a fever and a cough. Now remember, the fever may be very mild, only 99 degrees or higher, and the cough's usually dry, meaning you're not coughing anything up. For that other 20% with more severe symptoms, those are patients that are typically greater than 65 years old and have other immunocompromising conditions like immunosuppression due to cancer therapy, chronic suppression with prednisone, high blood pressure, diabetes, lung disease like COPD or emphysema, or heart disease. They should be more mindful of their symptoms because they're more at risk for having severe disease. The two clear ways to monitor at home are with hypoxia and your respiratory rate. Let me start by explaining a little bit about what hypoxia is. Hypoxia is when you have a low oxygen saturation, meaning that there's not enough oxygen getting to the tissues in your brain and in your body in general. There's one way to check this at home with a little device. This device is called a pulse oximeter. It's available on Amazon for about 20 to 40 bucks. It's really easy to use. Now, I'm not advocating that everyone run out and get a pulse oximeter, but for those higher risk patients, I do think it might be a good idea to have. I happen to have had a pulse oximeter at my home because when my little boys were smaller, they often struggled or had croup, and I would like to check their pulse ox before deciding whether to take them to the emergency room or not. Pulse oximeters, like I said, are really easy to use. What they're doing is they're measuring the oxygen saturation in the blood. It's really kind of a neat tool. It's really easy and simple to use. You open it up, place it on your finger, and then you wait for a certain amount of time. A normal oxygen saturation is between about 95 to 100. Anything below 95%, and especially in the low 90s or upper 80s, is concerning, especially if you also have symptoms of COVID-19. Mine reads 99%. I'm nervous right now, so my pulse is really high. A pulse of about 60 to 80 is normal, and I'm not as concerned about pulse rate as I am about this pulse ox. The pulse ox, like I said, of 95 to 99% is normal. When you have COVID-19, if you're starting to see pulse oximetry numbers less than 95, and especially in the low 90s and upper 80s, that is an indication that things are not going well, and you should start to consider going to the emergency room. Another way to monitor your symptoms at home is with your respiratory rate. A normal respiratory rate for an adult is 12 to 20 respirations per minute. So if you start to see a respiratory rate of greater than 30, That's very concerning, and I would start to consider going to the emergency room. What should you do if you don't have a pulse oximeter? Well, there are some things to also look for. Bluish tint around the lips or bluish coloration of the fingertips, or if that person starts to feel really tired or they start to not make much sense. You know, hypoxia can creep up on you and you don't tend to have straightforward symptoms besides just this reading. So it can be silent, which is why I think having a pulse oximeter at hand is a good idea for those that are at higher risk. How long after symptoms start with COVID-19 do we see patients entering the hospital? Well, based on a study of 21 patients out of Washington in the Journal of American Medical Association, published just 2 days ago, it was about 3.5 days. Another concerning find when patients enter the hospital is to have bilateral infiltrates, meaning that there's collections on the lungs that are not normal. There are lots of different infiltrates and lots of different meanings for infiltrates, but having bilateral infiltrates over about 50% of the lungs is a very concerning finding as well. You won't know about that though until the patient enters the hospital and gets an x-ray. At the end of the day, I want to continue to stress that the most important thing that we Americans can do is social distancing. 6 feet apart, staying in small groups to limit the easy transmission of coronavirus. We're trying to protect those older adults and patients with immunosuppression and chronic disease. Thanks again for joining me.
And in cases like myself, I have a paralyzed diaphragm, so you may start with 100% oxygen. I start with 93, so if I have an issue, if I'm out of breath, it's like 88, 89, so that's critical for most people. But for me, I don't freak out. So the next one is going to be about risk, and this is a really cool one because she has a little list of risk, and she's going to be talking about that for COVID-19. So let's listen to what the doctor has to say.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Your Health with Dr. Christy. My name is Dr. Christy Reisinger, and today I'd like to spotlight something that the Texas Medical Association recently put out that lists almost 40 different activities and rates their risk level. I think it's a really great way for us to all understand that at the end of the day, coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is likely to be around for a long time. And we need to all take a step back and look at the activities that we're doing on a daily basis and see which ones we're comfortable with. This is such a personal decision. No one can really make that decision for you, and every single situation is so different. How old are the people living in your home? Do you have contact with people that are high risk? So I'd like to go through some of these activities and explain some of the rationale behind them, and once again, continue to try to provide reassurance. Let's look at the chart together. So as you can see from the chart, the scale is from 1 to 9. The items on the lower end of the scale are lower risk. The absolute lowest risk item that they determined was opening your mail. This is based on data that shows that SARS-CoV-2 most likely isn't really transferred from fomites. Fomites are objects that have the virus on them. As we've seen, this is a respiratory illness spread through respiratory droplets. So something like the mail that often sits in your mailbox for long periods of time out in the hot sun has very low probability of having the virus on it at all, and an even lower probability of giving you COVID-19 because there likely are very, very few viral particles on an envelope. Next, let's jump to the highest risk activities. Those 4 activities include attending a large music concert, going to a sports stadium, attending a religious service with 500 or more people, and going to a bar. I'd like to point out that all of these things I'm assuming are inside. I don't think they're assuming that you're going to an outdoor concert where you can socially distance from one another. I'm assuming that these are all activities indoors. And we know the higher risk activities include activities that include a lot of people over an extended period of time indoors with poor circulation. And these upper 4 items meet all 4 of those criteria. But I do want to point out that each item can become more risky if someone next to you coughs in your face, or sneezes in your face. So for example, they list swimming in a public pool as a number 6. I totally agree with that, unless you're sitting in a crowd with people on the side of the pool, no one's wearing masks, and someone coughs in your face. Then obviously that risk level jumps up tremendously. But I do think it's helpful to look at this chart and realize we make decisions on a daily basis about our personal level of risk that we're comfortable with. I just don't think it's necessary to shame and highlight other people's activities when they simply have a higher threshold for tolerating risk. At the end of the day, it's what suits your family and your circumstances. For the people that live in your house, it's such a personal decision. Once again, I'd like to continue to stress hand washing, social distancing, and wearing a mask. Thanks for joining me.
So we have this here, this little list of the different risks that we have, and it's kind of cool. And I go along with what she has to say also. Low to moderate risk is going to things like library, museum. We have one of those, each of one of those. So I agree with what she says. And remember, when you're looking at the videos for a lot of people, they have the comments on the bottom. So you can listen to what they say. Plus also there's a little discussion afterwards, mostly for the positive, that is good to listen to also. So I hope you've got a lot of more information on this subject. I wanted to get you as much as possible from the doctor. Remember the back to school fair. Thanks a lot. We're out of time.